Lieutenant Sarah Martinez adjusted her Navy SEAL trident one last time before walking through the glass doors of the Pentagon's executive conference room. 8 years of blood, sweat, and proving herself in a world that never wanted her there had led to this moment. The weight of her uniform felt different today, heavier somehow, as if it carried the expectations of every woman who had ever dreamed of wearing the trident. The room buzzed with quiet conversation as she entered. 3 admirals sat at the far end of the polished mahogany table, their faces unreadable masks of military professionalism. Sarah recognized Admiral Thompson immediately. His reputation preceded him, known for breaking careers as easily as he made them. To his left sat Admiral Chun, the first Asian American woman to reach flag rank, and to his right, Admiral Rodriguez, whose own special operations background made him a legend in the teams. Sarah snapped to attention, her spine straight as a rifle barrel. Lieutenant Martinez reporting as ordered, sir. Admiral Thompson didn't look up from the thick file spread before him. Take a seat, Lieutenant. We have much to discuss. The chair felt cold against her back as she settled into it, hands placed precisely on her knees. The silence stretched like a taut wire, broken only by the distant hum of Pentagon traffic. Sarah had faced down armed insurgents in Fallujah, navigated treacherous mountain passes in Afghanistan, and completed underwater demolition missions that would make grown men weep. But sitting in this sterile room, surrounded by 3 of the most powerful people in the Navy, she felt a different kind of tension building in her chest. Admiral Chun finally broke the silence, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had fought similar battles. Your record is impressive, Lieutenant. Top of your BUD/S class, distinguished service in 3 combat deployments, and commendations that read like a Hollywood script. Your teammates speak of you with respect that borders on reverence. Sarah kept her expression neutral, though pride swelled in her chest. Those commendations had cost her everything. Broken bones that healed crooked, relationships that withered under the strain of constant deployments, and a social life that existed only in the spaces between missions. Each medal in her dress blues represented months of preparation, minutes of terror, and years of recovery. However, Admiral Thompson's voice cut through her thoughts like a blade. We're not here to discuss your past achievements. We're here to discuss your future and whether you have one in the teams. The words hit her like a physical blow. Sarah's hands tightened imperceptibly on her knees, the only outward sign of the earthquake happening inside her chest. Sir, I don't understand. My performance evaluations have been exemplary. My team leaders have recommended me for advanced training, and I've never failed mission objective. Admiral Rodriguez leaned forward, his weathered face showing the scars of his own special operations career. The nature of special warfare is changing, Lieutenant. We're not just fighting conventional enemies anymore. We're fighting perception wars, political battles, and public opinion campaigns. Every operator we deploy becomes a representative of American values and military excellence. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. She had heard whispers in the corridors, rumors about political pressure from certain congressional committees, media attention on women in special operations roles. Some politicians wanted poster girls for equality. Others wanted any excuse to roll back immigration policies. She had always hoped her performance would speak louder than politics. The question before us, Admiral Chen continued, is whether you can represent those values and capacities beyond direct action missions. We're considering you for a position that would require you to interface with foreign dignitaries, congressional committees, and media representatives. Your uniform would carry different weight in those contexts. Admiral Thompson finally looked up from his file, his gray eyes boring into hers. The position would require someone who can command respect without the benefit of their service record speaking first. Someone who can walk into any room, anywhere in the world, and project American strength and competence based solely on their presence and character. Sarah's mind raced through the implications. They were talking about some kind of diplomatic or liaison role, something that would take her away from the teams, away from the brotherhood she had bled to join. The idea felt like betrayal, not of her country, but of herself. With all due respect, sirs, my place is with my team. I didn't spend 8 years earning this trident to become a political symbol or a spokesperson. I'm a warrior, not a diplomat. The three admirals exchanged glances that spoke of conversations Sarah wasn't privy to. Admiral Rodriguez drummed his fingers once against the table, a sound that echoed like gunshots in the quiet room. Lieutenant, Admiral Thompson said slowly, what if I told you that this position could potentially save more American lives than any mission you've ever completed? What if the intelligence gathering and relationship building aspects of this role could prevent conflicts that would otherwise cost us hundreds of operators? Sarah felt the ground shifting beneath her. As a SEAL, she had always operated under clear parameters. Identify the target, develop a plan, execute the mission, extract safely. Success was measurable in tangible terms. Enemies eliminated, hostages rescued, intelligence gathered. This new role sounded like something where success might be measured in meetings attended and hands shaken. Furthermore, Admiral Chen added, this position would make you the first woman to hold such a role in Special Operations Liaison. You would be blazing a trail for every female operator who comes after you. The weight of representation settled on Sarah's shoulders like lead blankets. She had never asked to be a trailblazer. She had simply wanted to serve her country to the best of her abilities. But somewhere along the way, her service had become symbolic of larger social changes happening within the military. Admiral Rodriguez opened a different folder, this one marked with classification stamps that made Sarah's security clearance seem inadequate. The role would involve working with allied special operations forces around the world, training exchanges, joint mission planning, diplomatic security for high-value targets. You would retain your SEAL qualification and continue advanced training, but your operational focus would shift. Sarah stared at the classified folder, wondering what information lay inside that could justify pulling her away from direct action roles. Her team was scheduled to deploy to East Africa in 3 months. They had been training together for over a year, developing the kind of wordless communication that kept people alive in hostile environments. I need to ask you something directly, Lieutenant, Admiral Thompson said, his voice carrying a weight that made her stomach clench. And I need you to answer with complete honesty. Do you believe you can command respect and represent American interests effectively regardless of what uniform you're wearing? Or do you feel your authority comes primarily from your SEAL status? The question hung in the air like smoke from an IED blast. Sarah understood now why the room felt so heavy, why the three admirals had been studying her so intently. This wasn't just about a new assignment. This was about testing the very core of who she believed herself to be. Her mind flashed back to a mission 2 years earlier in Syria. Her team had been pinned down by enemy fire, cut off from extraction, with 2 wounded teammates and dwindling ammunition. The local militia commander who eventually provided safe passage hadn't known she was a SEAL. He hadn't seen her uniform or her medals. He had simply looked into her eyes during negotiations and decided she was someone he could trust. But that had been different. That had been a life-or-death situation where desperation and authentic emotion cut through cultural barriers. Could she project that same authority in a Pentagon briefing room or a state dinner? Could she walk into a meeting with foreign intelligence officers and command their respect based solely on her presence and competence? Permission to ask a question, sir, Sarah said finally. Granted. Is this assignment voluntary, or am I being ordered to accept it? Admiral Thompson's expression didn't change, but something flickered behind his eyes that might have been approval. Right now, Lieutenant, we're simply gauging your interest and suitability. The final decision would be yours to make, with full understanding of what you're accepting or declining. Sarah nodded slowly. Then, I respectfully request time to consider the offer, sir. This would represent a significant change in my career trajectory, and I want to make sure I can give you a decision that serves the Navy's interests as well as my own. Admiral Chen smiled for the first time during the meeting. That's exactly the kind of thoughtful response we hope to hear. Take your time, Lieutenant. This decision will shape not only your future, but potentially the future of women in special operations for years to come. As Sarah stood to leave, Admiral Rodriguez called her name one final time. Lieutenant Martinez, one more thing. The position would occasionally require you to operate in civilian clothes, in contexts where your military affiliation might need to be concealed? Would you have any difficulty projecting authority and competence without your uniform? Sarah paused at the door, her hand on the polished brass handle. The question struck at something fundamental about her identity. She had become so accustomed to the respect that came with her uniform, the immediate recognition of her capabilities that her ribbons and trident provided, that she honestly wasn't sure who she would be without them. I believe I would, sir. But I think I owe it to myself and to the Navy to test that belief before I commit to anything. Admiral Thompson nodded approvingly. Dismissed, Lieutenant. We'll expect your answer within 2 weeks. Sarah walked out of the conference room with her mind spinning like a centrifuge. The corridor seemed longer than it had when she entered, and her uniform felt simultaneously heavier and more fragile. She had spent her entire adult life defining herself through her service, measuring her worth against military standards, and finding her identity within the rigid structure of naval hierarchy. Now, 3 admirals had essentially asked her to prove she was more than the sum of her decorations. They wanted to know if the woman inside the uniform could stand on her own, command respect without the benefit of rank and ribbon, and represent American interests in situations where her SEAL status might be more liability than asset. As she walked toward the Pentagon parking garage, Sarah found herself studying her reflection in the polished windows lining the corridor. The woman looking back at her wore the uniform with obvious pride and competence, but who was she underneath all the ribbons and regulations? Could she walk into any room in the world and project strength, confidence, and authority based solely on her character and presence? The questions followed her to her car, haunted her drive back to Virginia Beach, and settled into her apartment like uninvited guests. For the first time in 8 years, Lieutenant Sarah Martinez wasn't sure who she was or what she was capable of becoming. The only thing she knew for certain was that her answer to the Admiral's offer would determine not just her future, but the future of every woman who dreamed of following in her footsteps. That night, she stood in her bedroom looking at her dress blue uniform hanging in the closet. The trident gleamed in the lamplight, and her ribbons told the story of a career built on impossible standards and unwavering dedication. But for the first time, she found herself wondering what story she might tell if she had to start writing it all over again. One where her worth wasn't measured in medals and commendations, but in something deeper and more fundamental. The test had begun, and she wasn't even sure what she was being tested on. 3 days after the Pentagon meeting, Sarah found herself sitting in a coffee shop in downtown Norfolk, staring at her phone screen, displaying a text from her team leader. Emergency briefing 0600 tomorrow. Deployment timeline moved up. Need you there. Her coffee had gone cold while she wrestled with thoughts that seemed to cycle endlessly through her mind like a broken navigation system. The coffee shop buzzed with civilian life. Students from Old Dominion University hunched over laptops, business people conducted hushed phone calls, and retirees read newspapers with the patience of people who had nowhere urgent to be. Sarah watched them with newfound curiosity, wondering what it would be like to exist in this world where success wasn't measured in mission parameters and failure didn't cost lives. Her phone rang, interrupting her observation. The caller ID showed her younger sister's name, and Sarah almost declined the call. Maria had a talent for reading her moods through phone conversations, and right now Sarah felt too vulnerable for that kind of scrutiny. "Hey sis," Sarah answered, trying to inject normalcy into her voice. "Don't hey sis me in that fake, cheerful voice," Maria shot back immediately. "I know something's wrong. You only use that tone when you're trying to hide something significant." Sarah sighed, conceding defeat before the battle even began. Maria was a clinical psychologist who specialized in treating veterans, and she had an uncanny ability to see through Sarah's carefully constructed emotional armor. "I got offered a new position," Sarah said carefully. "It will be a significant career change. Good different or scary different?" Sarah stirred her cold coffee absently, watching the cream swirl into patterns that reminded her of aerial reconnaissance photos. "Both, maybe. It would take me away from the teams, put me in a more diplomatic role. Lots of travel, high-level meetings, representing the Navy in situations that don't involve tactical operations. Maria was quiet for a long moment, and Sarah could almost hear her sister's psychology training kicking in. Are you afraid they're trying to sideline you? Put the woman in a safe job where she can be a symbol instead of a warrior. The question hit closer to the truth than Sarah was comfortable admitting. Maybe. Or maybe they're offering me something that could actually make a bigger difference than what I'm doing now. I honestly don't know. When do you have to decide? 2 weeks from yesterday. That's not very long for a life-changing decision. What does your gut tell you? Sarah laughed bitterly. My gut tells me that I don't know who I am without this uniform. That's a pretty terrifying realization for someone who's supposed to be an elite warrior. Maria's voice softened. Sarah, you've been defining yourself through military service since you were 18 years old. It makes sense that stepping outside that framework feels scary. But maybe that's exactly what you need to do to figure out who you really are. After ending the call with Maria, Sarah drove to the base, her mind churning through memories and possibilities. The familiar sight of Naval Amphibious Base Little Creek brought its usual sense of homecoming, but today it felt different, like she was seeing it through the eyes of someone who might soon be leaving it behind. She found her team leader, Commander Jake Reeves, in the Tactical Operations Center, bent over satellite imagery with the focused intensity that had made him legendary in special operations circles. Maps covered every available surface, and the room hummed with the quiet energy of mission planning. Martinez, he said without looking up. We need to talk. Conference room 3, 5 minutes. Sarah grabbed a cup of coffee from the break room and joined Commander Reeves in the small conference room adjacent to the operations center. He closed the door behind her, and she noticed he looked more serious than usual, which was saying something for a man who approached grocery shopping with tactical precision. I got a call from Admiral Thompson yesterday, he said without preamble. He wanted my assessment of your readiness for an assignment I'm not clear to know details about. Sarah felt her stomach drop. What did you tell him, sir? I told him the truth. That you're one of the finest operators I've ever worked with, that your team trusts you completely, and that losing you would be a significant blow to our operational capability. He paused, studying her face. But I also told him that if the Navy has an opportunity to utilize your skills in a broader capacity, I wouldn't stand in your way. Sarah stared at the conference table, its surface scarred from years of mission planning sessions. He offered me a liaison position, something involving diplomatic work and high-level coordination with Allied forces. Commander Reeves nodded slowly. I figure it was something like that. The question is, what do you want to do? I don't know, sir. This team, these missions, they're everything I've worked for. But part of me wonders if I'm being selfish by turning down something that could potentially have a broader impact. Let me ask you something, Commander Reeves said, leaning back in his chair. Remember that hostage situation in Mosul 2 years ago? When you had to negotiate with the tribal elder while we were planning the assault? Sarah nodded. It had been one of the most challenging aspects of that mission, requiring her to balance cultural sensitivity with operational necessity while building trust with someone who had every reason to distrust American forces. You handled that negotiation better than any diplomat I've ever worked with, he continued. You read people's intentions, adapted your communication style to match theirs, and achieved objectives that saved lives. Those skills aren't limited to tactical situations. But that was different. I was still operating as a SEAL, still had my team backing me up. This new role will be different. Solo operations in environments where I can't rely on military protocol or authority. Commander Reeves was quiet for a moment, and Sarah recognized the expression on his face. It was the same look he got when he was working through complex tactical problems, weighing variables, and calculating probabilities. You know what I think your real fear is? He said finally. I think you're afraid that your confidence and authority come from external validation rather than internal strength. You're worried that without the uniform and the backup, you might discover you're not as capable as you thought. Sarah felt exposed, as if her team leader had just performed psychological reconnaissance on her deepest insecurities. Maybe you're right. Here's what I know about you, Lieutenant. You didn't earn that trident because you looked good in a uniform. You earned it because you have something inside you that can't be taught or faked. The uniform doesn't make you a SEAL. Being a SEAL makes the uniform meaningful. That afternoon, Sarah drove to Virginia Beach and walked along the oceanfront, trying to sort through the competing voices in her head. The Atlantic stretched endlessly eastward, and she found herself thinking about all the missions that had taken her across that water, all the time she had deployed into uncertainty with nothing but her training and her teammates to rely on. Her phone buzzed with a text from her former BUD/S instructor, Master Chief Petty Officer Williams. Heard through the grapevine, you might be taking on a new challenge. Remember what I taught you about comfort zones? Sarah smiled despite her confusion. Master Chief Williams had a saying that he repeated throughout BUD/S training. Growth happens in the space between comfort and panic. Find that space and live there. At the time, she had thought he was talking about physical challenges, pushing through pain barriers and endurance limits. Now, she wondered if he had been teaching them something broader about life itself. She sat down on a piece of driftwood and called him back, knowing he would be direct in a way that would cut through her confusion. Martinez, his gravelly voice, answered immediately. I was wondering when you'd call. Master Chief, I need advice. I got an opportunity that could change everything, but I'm not sure I'm ready for it. Tell me about it. Sarah explained the liaison position, the diplomatic responsibilities, and her fears about operating outside the clearly defined parameters of special operations missions. Master Chief Williams listened without interruption, and she could picture him in his office, leaning back in his chair with his feet up on his desk, processing everything with the analytical mind that had shaped thousands of SEALs. Sounds to me like they're asking you to do advanced reconnaissance, he said finally. Except instead of gathering intelligence on enemy positions, you'd be gathering intelligence on foreign relationships and political terrain. Different environment, same skill set. But what if I fail? What if I get into a situation where I can't adapt or perform without my team backing me up? Martinez, do you remember Hell Week? Sarah almost laughed. As if anyone could forget Hell Week, the infamous 5.5-day endurance test that eliminated more BUD/S candidates than any other part of SEAL training. She had completed it with stress fractures in both legs and an infection that made her fever spike to dangerous levels. Of course, Master Chief. Do you remember what got you through it? Sarah thought back to those 5 days of constant physical and mental torture when sleep deprivation and exhaustion had stripped away every pretense and reduced her to her essential core. I remember deciding that failure wasn't an option, that no matter what they threw at me, I was going to find a way to continue. Exactly. And that decision didn't come from your uniform or your team. That came from something inside you that existed before you ever joined the Navy. The question isn't whether you can succeed in this new role. The question is whether you're willing to trust that same inner strength in a different environment. That evening, Sarah stood in front of her bathroom mirror, studying her reflection without the benefit of her uniform. She saw a woman in her late 20s, physically fit from years of rigorous training, with scars that told stories of missions she couldn't discuss, and eyes that had seen things most people only experienced in nightmares. But she also saw something else, something she had almost forgotten existed. Behind the tactical awareness and professional competence, there was still the young woman who had walked into a Navy recruiter's office 8 years ago with nothing but determination and a desire to serve something larger than herself. That woman had been confident without ribbons, capable without rank, and strong without the validation of her peers. She had possessed an inner compass that pointed towards service and excellence regardless of external circumstances. Somewhere along the way, Sarah had started to mistake the uniform for the person wearing it. She thought about the Syria militia commander who had looked into her eyes and seen someone he could trust. She thought about the tribal elder in Mosul who had shared critical intelligence because he recognized her sincerity. She thought about countless moments in her career when her effectiveness had come not from her SEAL status, but from her ability to read situations, adapt to circumstances, and project competence through her actions rather than her credentials. Maybe the admirals weren't asking her to abandon everything she had worked for. Maybe they were asking her to trust that everything she had learned could be applied in broader contexts, that the skills she had developed as a SEAL could serve larger purposes than direct action missions. Sarah pulled out her laptop and began researching the current state of international special operations cooperation, diplomatic security challenges, and the role of military liaisons in preventing conflicts. The more she read, the more she understood the scope of what the admirals were offering her. It wasn't a consolation prize or a way to sideline her. It was an opportunity to apply her skills at a strategic level that could potentially impact thousands of lives. By midnight, she had filled 3 pages with notes about current international tensions, areas where improved military cooperation could prevent conflicts, and specific challenges that required someone with both operational experience and diplomatic skills. The role was starting to look less like exile and more like evolution. Her final task before bed was to call Commander Reeves and ask about the accelerated deployment timeline. If she was going to accept the liaison position, she needed to know whether she would be abandoning her team at a critical moment. "Sir, about tomorrow's briefing," she said when he answered. "How critical is my participation in the upcoming deployment?" "We can manage without you if necessary," he said after a pause. "It would require some adjustments to our operational plan, but we've got good people who can step up." "Why do you ask?" "I think I'm going to accept the Admiral's offer. But I want to make sure I'm not leaving the team in an untenable position." "Martinez, if you're making this decision based on what's best for the team rather than what's best for you, you're making for the wrong reasons. We'll adapt and continue our mission. You need to focus on what direction your career should take." After hanging up, Sarah sat in her apartment's small living room, surrounded by mementos from 8 years of service. Photographs from deployments, commendations framed on walls, and equipment that had kept her alive in hostile environments. All of it represented a version of herself that she was proud of, but maybe it was time to discover what other versions might be possible. She picked up her phone and began composing a text to Admiral Thompson's aide, requesting a meeting to discuss the liaison position in more detail. Before sending it, she paused and looked once more at her reflection in the dark window. The woman looking back at her wore civilian clothes and bore no external markers of military service, but her posture still carried the confidence of someone who had survived the impossible. For the first time in days, she felt certain about something. She was ready to find out who she might become when she stopped hiding behind her uniform and started trusting the person who had earned the right to wear it in the first place. Admiral Thompson's aide had scheduled the follow-up meeting for 1,400 hours on a Thursday afternoon, giving Sarah exactly 1 week to prepare for what felt like the most important conversation of her career. She spent those 7 days conducting her own reconnaissance, reaching out to contacts in allied militaries, researching diplomatic protocols, and trying to understand the full scope of what the liaison position might entail. The meeting was held in the same Pentagon conference room, but this time only Admiral Chun was present, her uniform immaculate as always, her expression unreadable. Sarah entered wearing her service dress blues, every ribbon perfectly aligned, her bearing radiating the confidence she had spent 8 years developing. "Please, sit down, Lieutenant," Admiral Chin said, gesturing to the same chair Sarah had occupied during her first meeting. "I understand you have some questions about the position we discussed." "Yes, ma'am. I've done extensive research into current international cooperation challenges, and I believe I have a better understanding of what this role might involve. However, I need clarification on several operational parameters." Admiral Chin smiled approvingly. "I'm impressed that you approached this like a mission briefing. What specific information do you need?" Sarah consulted the notebook she had filled with questions over the past week. "First, what would be my actual authority in diplomatic situations? Would I be operating under State Department guidance, Pentagon directives, or some hybrid command structure?" "You would report directly to the Joint Chiefs through a classified command structure that interfaces with both State Department and Pentagon leadership. Your authority would be clearly defined within specific parameters, but you would have significant autonomy in how you achieve designated objectives. Second, what kind of backup and support would I have in situations where diplomatic solutions fail and security becomes a primary concern?" Admiral Chun leaned forward, and Sarah noticed a slight shift in her demeanor that suggested they were moving into more sensitive territory. "That's where your SEAL background becomes particularly valuable. You would be operating in environments where traditional diplomatic security might be inadequate, where your ability to assess threats and take appropriate action could be critical." Sarah felt a chill of understanding. This wasn't just about liaison work, and relationship building. They were talking about placing her in situations where her military skills might be the difference between successful negotiations and international incidents. Third, would this position be permanent, or could I potentially return to direct operations if the role doesn't work out? Nothing in military service is permanent, Lieutenant. However, this position would likely lead to opportunities that would take you further from traditional SEAL operations. You would be building expertise that's rare and valuable, skills that would make you uniquely qualified for senior leadership positions. Admiral Chen opened a folder that Sarah hadn't noticed before, revealing photographs and documents that made her security clearance feel insufficient. I want to show you something that might help you understand why we're having this conversation. The first photograph showed a bombed building in what appeared to be Eastern Europe, twisted metal, and concrete debris scattered across a city street. The second showed a group of European military officers standing around a conference table, their faces grim with the weight of failed negotiations. This happened 6 months ago, Admiral Chen explained. A joint training exercise between NATO allies and former Soviet bloc countries went catastrophically wrong. What should have been a routine cooperation building event became a 3-day crisis that nearly sparked regional conflict. Sarah studied the photographs, noting tactical details automatically while processing the broader implications. What went wrong? Multiple communication failures, cultural misunderstandings, and a fundamental lack of trust between participating units. The American liaison officer assigned to coordinate the exercise was a career diplomat with no operational experience. When things started going wrong, he didn't have the credibility or understanding necessary to prevent escalation. Admiral Chun pulled out another photograph, this one showing a woman in civilian clothes standing between two groups of armed soldiers, her hands raised in a gesture that seemed to be simultaneously calming and commanding. This is Colonel Elena Kozlov, Russian Spetsnaz, currently assigned to their International Cooperation Office. She prevented the situation from becoming a shooting war by stepping outside established diplomatic protocols and appealing directly to the operational commanders on both sides. Sarah felt pieces clicking into place like weapon components during field stripping. You need someone who can operate effectively in both diplomatic and military contexts. Someone who understands operational realities, but can also navigate political complexities. Exactly. Colonel Kozlov has become a model for what modern military liaison work requires. She combines tactical expertise with diplomatic skill, and her counterparts respect her because she's proven herself in both arenas. We need American officers who can match that level of effectiveness. Admiral Chen closed the folder and fixed Sarah with a direct stare. The question is whether you're ready to become that kind of officer. Whether you can project American interests and values in situations where your uniform might not be appropriate or sufficient. Sarah felt the familiar sensation of mission parameters crystallizing, objectives becoming clear through the fog of uncertainty. You're asking me to test whether my authority comes from my rank or from my character. I'm asking you to prove something that I already believe to be true. That the best special operations officers possess leadership qualities that transcend their military status. Admiral Chun stood and walked to the windows overlooking the Pentagon parking lot, her hands clasped behind her back in a posture Sarah recognized from countless briefings with senior officers. I want to propose something unconventional. A trial period where you can test your effectiveness in this role before making a final commitment. Sarah straightened in her chair, sensing that Admiral Chun was about to reveal the real reason for this meeting. What kind of trial period, ma'am? There's a conference in Geneva next month. Representatives from 12 allied nations will be discussing joint counterterrorism cooperation. The American delegation will include State Department officials, Pentagon representatives, and one military liaison officer. Admiral Chun turned back to face Sarah, and there was something in her expression that suggested the next few sentences would be critical. The liaison officer assigned to this conference just became unavailable due to a family emergency. We need someone who can represent American special operations interests while building relationships with allied commanders. Sarah felt her pulse quicken. This was it, the test that would determine whether she could succeed in the role the admirals were offering. What will my specific responsibilities be? You would attend all conference sessions in civilian clothes, no military identification except what's necessary for security purposes. You would be introduced simply as a representative of American military training programs. Your job would be to assess allied capabilities, identify opportunities for cooperation, and build relationships that could facilitate future joint operations. The implications were staggering. She would be representing American interests without the benefit of her uniform, her rank, or her SEAL status. Success would depend entirely on her ability to project competence and command respect through her knowledge, communication skills, and personal presence. Furthermore, Admiral Chun continued, there will be foreign intelligence officers at this conference who would love to identify American Special Operations personnel. Your ability to maintain operational security while still achieving diplomatic objectives would be crucial. Sarah realized this wasn't just a test of her diplomatic skills. It was an assessment of her ability to operate undercover, maintain multiple covers simultaneously, and achieve complex objectives in a politically sensitive environment. The kind of mission that required skills she had been developing as a SEAL, but applied in contexts she had never experienced. I accept, she said without hesitation. Admiral Chun smiled for the second time in their meeting. I hope you would. However, I want you to understand exactly what you're accepting. This conference will likely determine whether you receive the liaison position permanently. Your performance will be evaluated not just by American officials, but by allied officers who might work with you in future assignments. Understood, Mom. When do I receive my briefing materials? Tomorrow morning, 0800 hours. You'll spend 2 weeks preparing with State Department protocol specialists, intelligence analysts, and cultural advisors. By the time you board the plane to Geneva, you'll need to be capable of representing American interests as effectively as any career diplomat. Admiral Chun gathered her files and prepared to leave, then paused at the door. One more thing, Lieutenant. This assignment will require you to make decisions without consulting higher authority, to adapt to situations that weren't covered in your briefing materials, and to trust your judgment in contexts where military protocol might be irrelevant or counterproductive. Sarah stood and came to attention. I understand, ma'am. Do you? Because what I'm really telling you is that you'll need to discover who you are when you can't rely on military structure to define your role. When success depends on your ability to read people, build trust, and project authority based solely on your personal competence. After Admiral Chun left, Sarah remained in the conference room for several minutes, processing the magnitude of what she had just accepted. In 3 weeks, she would be sitting in a conference room in Geneva, surrounded by foreign intelligence officers and allied military commanders, with nothing but her wits and her character to establish her credibility. The drive back to Virginia Beach passed in a blur of strategic planning and nervous energy. Sarah found herself analyzing the challenge like a mission, breaking it down into component parts, and identifying the skills she would need to develop in the next 2 weeks. First, she would need to master diplomatic protocols and international relations theory well enough to communicate effectively with career diplomats and foreign ministry officials. Second, she would need to develop cover stories and personas that would allow her to gather intelligence without revealing her SEAL background. Third, she would need to prepare for scenarios where her operational training might be necessary, but where using it could create international incidents. That evening, she called Commander Reeves to inform him of her decision and request temporary assignment to the Liaison Preparation Program. His response was characteristically direct. "You're sure about this?" he asked. "I'm sure I need to find out if I can succeed at it," Sarah replied. "If I fail, at least I'll know I tested myself against something challenging. And if you succeed?" Sarah considered the question carefully. If she succeeded in Geneva, she would likely spend the rest of her career operating in the gray spaces between military action and diplomatic necessity, solving problems that couldn't be addressed through conventional means. It would mean giving up the clear-cut mission parameters and team support that had defined her professional identity. If I succeed, I'll probably discover that I'm capable of things I never imagined. Commander Reeves was quiet for a moment. Well, if anyone can figure out how to be a warrior and a diplomat simultaneously, it's probably you. Just remember that some of your most important missions might not look like missions at all. After hanging up, Sarah stood in her apartment, surrounded by the familiar artifacts of her military career. Tomorrow she would begin preparing for a role that would require her to set aside everything external that defined her as a SEAL and rely instead on the internal qualities that had made her worthy of earning that status in the first place. She walked to her closet and looked at her dress blue uniform one more time, noting how the ribbons caught the light and the way the trident seemed to anchor everything else in place. In 3 weeks, she would be sitting in meetings where displaying any of those symbols could compromise her effectiveness and endanger her mission. For the first time since her conversation with the admirals began, Sarah felt genuinely excited rather than terrified. The challenge ahead would test every skill she had developed as a special operations officer, but it would also require her to develop new capabilities that could expand her potential for service beyond anything she had previously imagined. She pulled out her laptop and began researching the political and military leaders who would be attending the Geneva conference, studying their backgrounds, their country's strategic interests, and the alliance relationships that would shape the negotiations. By dawn, she had filled another notebook with intelligence that would inform her preparation for the most complex mission of her career. The test was no longer theoretical. In 17 days, she would discover whether Lieutenant Sarah Martinez could succeed when she couldn't hide behind the protection of her uniform and the support of her team. Whether the person who had earned the right to wear the trident was strong enough to represent American interests when that trident had to remain hidden. The real challenge wasn't proving she could succeed without her SEAL status. The challenge was proving that her SEAL status had been earned by someone who possessed qualities that could serve much larger purposes than direct action missions. In Geneva, she would find out if 8 years of the most demanding military training in the world had created someone capable of changing the course of international relations through the force of character alone. The countdown had begun, and for the first time in her career, success would be measured not in enemies eliminated or hostages rescued, but in relationships built, trust established, and conflicts prevented through the kind of quiet professionalism that never made headlines but potentially saved thousands of lives. Sarah Martinez was about to discover what kind of warrior she really was. 2 weeks of intensive preparation had transformed Sarah's apartment into a miniature intelligence center. Maps of Geneva covered her dining table, cultural briefing documents lined her kitchen counter, and language learning materials occupied every available surface. She had spent 14 days immersed in diplomatic theory, international law, and the subtle art of reading people's intentions through their body language and word choices. The morning of her departure, Sarah stood in front of her bedroom mirror, adjusting a charcoal gray business suit that felt as foreign as body armor had during her first day of SEAL training. The woman looking back at her appeared professional and competent, but she bore no visible connection to the military officer who had walked into Admiral Thompson's office 3 weeks earlier. Her suitcase contained 3 different wardrobes designed for various social situations she might encounter in Geneva, along with communication equipment that appeared to be standard business electronics, but provided encrypted links to Pentagon intelligence analysts. The most challenging aspect of her preparation had been learning to project authority without relying on military bearing or terminology that would identify her background. Sarah's phone buzzed with a final text from Admiral Chun. "Remember, your success will be measured not by information gathered, but by relationships established. Trust your instincts." The flight to Geneva passed uneventfully, giving Sarah time to review her cover identity one final time. According to her credentials, she was Sarah Martinez, a consultant specializing in international security training programs, with advanced degrees from Georgetown and experience working with military contractors. The identity was close enough to her actual background to feel authentic while obscuring her SEAL status completely. Upon arrival at Geneva's International Airport, Sarah was met by a State Department protocol officer who briefed her on the conference logistics while they rode into the city center. The United Nations office at Geneva would host the 3-day conference, bringing together military and intelligence representatives from 12 allied nations to discuss counterterrorism cooperation. "Your role is somewhat unusual," the protocol officer explained as they passed through Geneva's elegant streets. Typically, military liaisons attend these conferences in uniform, representing their service branches directly. You'll be operating more like an intelligence analyst, gathering information about allied capabilities while building relationships that could facilitate future cooperation. Sarah nodded, absorbing the implications. She would be walking a fine line between diplomatic engagement and intelligence gathering, requiring skills that hadn't been covered in any military training manual. The hotel where delegates were staying occupied a historic building overlooking Lake Geneva, its elegant lobby bustling with international visitors speaking half a dozen languages. Sarah checked in using her consulting credentials and received a welcome packet that included conference schedules, biographical information on attending delegates, and social event invitations. That evening's reception would provide her first opportunity to meet the foreign representatives she had spent 2 weeks studying. As she prepared for the event, Sarah found herself applying mental techniques she had learned for pre-mission preparation. She reviewed her objectives, anticipated potential challenges, and mentally rehearsed responses to various scenarios that might arise. The reception was held in the hotel's ballroom, an elegant space where crystal chandeliers illuminated conversations conducted in the careful language of international diplomacy. Sarah entered wearing a navy blue cocktail dress that struck the right balance between professional authority and social appropriateness, her posture reflecting confidence without the rigid bearing that would suggest military background. Within minutes of entering the reception, Sarah spotted several of the key figures she needed to engage. Colonel Elena Kozlov, the Russian Spetsnaz officer Admiral Chun had mentioned, stood near the windows overlooking the lake, engaged in animated conversation with what appeared to be German military representatives. Her bearing was unmistakably military despite her elegant evening wear, and Sarah recognized the same challenge she was facing: how to project competence while operating outside familiar military protocols. Sarah approached a smaller group of delegates from Nordic countries, introducing herself as a security training consultant and gradually steering the conversation toward regional cooperation challenges. Within 20 minutes, she had gathered valuable intelligence about Swedish special operations capabilities and Norwegian concerns about Russian military activity near their borders. The key breakthrough came when she was introduced to Major David Fletcher, a British SAS officer whose casual demeanor masked what Sarah recognized as elite operational experience. Unlike many of the delegates, Fletcher seemed genuinely interested in substantive discussion rather than diplomatic pleasantries. "I understand you work with military training programs," he said after they had exchanged introductory pleasantries. "Have you noticed changes in how Allied forces approach joint operations training?" Sarah seized the opportunity to demonstrate knowledge that would establish her credibility. "The most significant change I've observed is the shift from standardized protocols toward adaptive methodologies. Special operations forces are increasingly focusing on cultural integration and communication skills rather than just technical proficiency." Fletcher's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, and Sarah realized she had passed some kind of test. That's exactly what we've been discussing in our after-action reports. The question is whether civilian leadership understands the implications for resource allocation and training priorities. The conversation continued for 30 minutes, during which Sarah demonstrated her understanding of operational realities while carefully avoiding details that would reveal her SEAL background. Fletcher responded by sharing insights about British Special Operations cooperation policies and expressing frustration with diplomatic constraints on military effectiveness. As the reception progressed, Sarah found herself naturally gravitating toward the military representatives rather than the diplomatic officials, drawn by shared understanding of operational challenges and strategic thinking. She realized that her SEAL background, even when hidden, influenced how she approached problems and interpreted information. The turning point came when she was approached by Colonel Kozlov, who had apparently been observing Sarah's interactions throughout the evening. The Russian officer's introduction was direct and assessing. "I understand you work in security consulting," Kozlov said in lightly accented English. "Your background appears more extensive than typical consultants I have encountered." Sarah felt the weight of evaluation behind the comment. Kozlov was clearly testing whether Sarah was actually who she claimed to be, and her response would determine whether the Russian officer treated her as a credible counterpart or dismissed her as irrelevant. My experience has been broad rather than deep, Sarah replied carefully. I've worked with various military organizations in training and assessment capacities, which provides perspective on common challenges across different operational environments. Kozlov studied Sarah's face for several seconds, and Sarah had the unsettling sensation of being analyzed by someone with similar training in reading people's intentions and capabilities. Finally, the Russian officer smiled slightly. Perhaps we should discuss these common challenges in more detail. Would you join me for coffee tomorrow morning before the conference sessions begin? Sarah accepted the invitation, recognizing it as both an opportunity and a test. Kozlov was offering her access to Russian perspectives on Allied cooperation, but the meeting would also allow the experienced Spetsnaz officer to assess Sarah's knowledge and intentions more thoroughly. The remainder of the reception passed in a blur of strategic conversations and careful intelligence gathering. Sarah collected business cards, exchanged contact information, and accepted invitations to social events that would provide additional opportunities for relationship building. Back in her hotel room, Sarah spent 2 hours writing detailed reports about the information she had gathered, analyzing personality assessments of key delegates, and preparing for the formal conference sessions that would begin the following morning. The encrypted communication system allowed her to transmit intelligence to Pentagon analysts while receiving updated guidance on priority information requirements. Her conversation with Colonel Kozlov would be particularly critical. The Russian officer represented exactly the kind of counterpart Sarah would need to work with if she accepted the liaison position permanently. Success in building that relationship could demonstrate her effectiveness in the role, while failure could indicate that she wasn't ready for the complex challenges the position would require. As she prepared for bed, Sarah reflected on how different the day had felt from any military operation she had ever conducted. The objectives were less clearly defined, success was harder to measure, and she was operating without the backup and support structures that had defined her professional life. Yet she had felt energized by the challenges and stimulated by the complexity of the relationships she was building. The next morning's coffee meeting with Colonel Kozlov took place in the hotel's restaurant, overlooking Lake Geneva's peaceful waters. The Russian officer arrived precisely on time, wearing a business suit that projected professional authority while concealing what Sarah assumed was excellent physical conditioning. "I've been thinking about our conversation last evening," Kozlov began after they had ordered coffee. "Your perspective on operational adaptation was quite sophisticated for someone working in civilian consulting." Sarah recognized the probe and decided to respond with partial honesty that might build trust without revealing classified information. "I've had opportunities to work closely with military personnel in various capacities. That exposure taught me to think about problems from operational perspectives rather than purely theoretical ones." Kozlov nodded approvingly. "This is what makes effective cooperation possible. Too many civilian officials understand policy, but not implementation. They create agreements that sound good in conference rooms, but fail when operational units attempt to execute them." The conversation evolved into a detailed discussion of practical challenges in military cooperation, with both women sharing insights about cultural barriers, communication difficulties, and resource constraints that complicated joint operations. Sarah found herself genuinely impressed by Kozlov's analytical capabilities and strategic thinking. "May I ask you a direct question?" Kozlov said after they had been talking for nearly an hour. "Of course. Are you actually a consultant, or are you a military officer operating under diplomatic cover?" Sarah felt her heart rate increase, but kept her expression neutral. The question was exactly what she had prepared for, but hearing it asked directly by someone of Kozlov's experience felt like facing incoming fire. "Why do you ask?" "Because your knowledge of operational realities is too specific for civilian education. Your assessment of military personalities is too accurate for academic study, and your bearings suggest training that consultants do not receive." Sarah realized she faced a critical decision. She could maintain her cover identity and potentially miss an opportunity to build genuine trust with someone who might become a crucial ally, or she could acknowledge her military background while maintaining operational security about her specific role. "You're very perceptive," Sarah said finally. My background includes military experience that I don't typically discuss in civilian contexts. Kozlov leaned back in her chair, and Sarah recognized satisfaction in her expression. I thought so. The question is whether you're here to assess Russian capabilities or to build genuine cooperation relationships. I'm here to determine whether effective cooperation is possible between professionals who understand operational realities, regardless of what uniforms we might normally wear. The answers seemed to satisfy Kozlov, who extended her hand across the table. Then, perhaps we can accomplish something useful during these 3 days. The handshake felt like a small victory, but Sarah knew the real test would come during the formal conference sessions, where she would need to demonstrate her value as a liaison officer while maintaining the delicate balance between honesty and operational security. That afternoon's first conference session focused on intelligence sharing protocols, bringing together representatives from all 12 allied nations in a secure meeting room at the UN office. Sarah took careful notes while observing the dynamics between different national delegations, noting areas of cooperation and tension that might impact future joint operations. During a break between sessions, Major Fletcher approached her with a proposal that would test her diplomatic skills more severely than anything she had experienced so far. Several of us are planning an informal dinner tonight, he said. Off-the-record discussion about operational challenges that we can't address through official channels. Would you be interested in joining us? Sarah realized Fletcher was offering her access to exactly the kind of intelligence-gathering opportunity that could make her mission a significant success. The informal dinner would likely reveal national capabilities, operational concerns, and strategic priorities that would never appear in official conference proceedings. I'd be honored to participate, she replied, understanding that she was accepting an invitation that would require her to operate at the highest levels of diplomatic and intelligence tradecraft. As the afternoon sessions continued, Sarah found herself thinking less about proving she could succeed without her SEAL status and more about how the skills she had developed as a special operations officer could serve broader strategic purposes. The challenge wasn't abandoning her military identity, but expanding it to encompass responsibilities that required different applications of the same core capabilities. By evening, she was beginning to understand why the admirals had chosen her for this test. The liaison role didn't require her to become someone different from who she had always been. It required her to become the fullest possible version of herself, applying military skills to diplomatic challenges while serving strategic objectives that were more complex and potentially more impactful than any tactical mission she had ever completed. The informal dinner that evening took place at a private restaurant overlooking Lake Geneva, attended by 7 military officers representing 6 allied nations. Sarah arrived wearing a simple black dress that projected professional competence, while allowing her to blend seamlessly with the group of experienced special operations personnel who had shed their diplomatic personas for a few hours of honest conversation. The attendees included Major Fletcher from British SAS, Colonel Kozlov from Russian Spetsnaz, Captain Maria Santos from Spanish Special Operations, Lieutenant Colonel Hans Weber from German KSK, Major Jean-Pierre Dubois from French Special Forces, and Commander Eric Nielsen from Norwegian Special Operations. Sarah found herself the only American representative and the only woman besides Kozlov. Before we begin, Fletcher announced after they had ordered wine, I want to establish that everything discussed tonight remains between the 7 of us. We're here to address operational realities that don't always align with our government's official positions. The conversation that followed was unlike anything Sarah had experienced in her military career. These were elite operators from different nations sharing perspectives on terrorism threats, resource limitations, political constraints, and coordination failures that had cost lives during joint operations. The level of trust required for such discussions represented exactly what the admirals had hoped she could achieve. Captain Santos began by describing a recent counterterrorism operation in the Sahel where Spanish and French forces had failed to coordinate effectively due to communication protocols that looked good on paper, but proved unworkable in practice. We had 3 different radio frequencies, 2 different command structures, and no common understanding of rules of engagement. It's a miracle no one was killed by friendly fire. Lieutenant Colonel Weber nodded grimly. We experienced similar problems during a hostage rescue exercise with American forces last year. Excellent individual unit capabilities, but integration was nearly impossible due to different tactical philosophies and training standards. Sarah realized this was her opportunity to demonstrate value while gathering intelligence that could influence future American special operations policies. What specific changes would improve coordination effectiveness? If you could redesign joint training programs from scratch, what would you prioritize? The question sparked an hour-long discussion that revealed critical intelligence about Allied special operations capabilities, training priorities, and strategic concerns. Sarah listened carefully while occasionally contributing insights that demonstrated her understanding of operational challenges without revealing her SEAL background. Colonel Kozlov eventually steered the conversation toward a more sensitive topic. The elephant in the room is political pressure on military effectiveness. We're all facing government officials who want special operations to achieve impossible objectives with inadequate resources while maintaining zero political risk. The comment opened floodgates of frustration that had apparently been building for years among these experienced officers. They shared stories of operations canceled due to political concerns, missions compromised by media attention, and strategic opportunities missed because of diplomatic timidity. The problem, Major Du Bois observed, is that our political leaders don't understand that special operations effectiveness requires acceptance of calculated risks. They want guaranteed success with zero potential for international embarrassment. Sarah found herself thinking about Admiral Thompson's comments regarding perception wars and political battles. The gap between operational realities and political expectations was apparently creating similar challenges for Allied forces around the world. What if there was a way to educate political leadership about operational requirements without compromising security or creating public relations problems? She asked carefully. Commander Nielsen looked at her with new interest. Are you suggesting some kind of liaison system that could bridge military and political understanding? I'm asking whether experienced operators like yourselves believe such a system could be effective and what it would need to look like to succeed. The discussion that followed provided Sarah with exactly the intelligence she needed to understand the strategic value of the liaison position the admirals were offering her. These Allied officers were describing a coordination role that could potentially prevent the kind of failures that had plagued international cooperation for decades. As the evening progressed, Sarah found herself naturally taking on a facilitating role, asking questions that encouraged the others to share information and perspectives that could inform future cooperation strategies. Her SEAL training in mission planning and strategic thinking proved invaluable in synthesizing complex information and identifying actionable solutions. The breakthrough moment came when Captain Santos addressed Sarah directly. You ask very sophisticated questions for a civilian consultant. Your understanding of operational challenges suggests extensive military experience. Sarah glanced around the table and realized all 6 officers were studying her with professional interest. She had reached another decision point where maintaining her cover might limit her effectiveness, while revealing her background could enhance trust and cooperation. You're right, she said finally. My background includes military experience that I don't typically discuss in diplomatic contexts. I'm here because American leadership is trying to determine whether better liaison relationships could improve Allied cooperation. Colonel Kozlov smiled knowingly. I suspected as much. The question is whether you're prepared to tell your leadership what they need to hear rather than what they want to hear. What do you mean? Lieutenant Colonel Weber leaned forward, his expression serious. Effective military cooperation requires trust that can only be built through shared experience and mutual respect. It cannot be achieved through diplomatic protocols or political agreements alone. Major Fletcher added, furthermore, successful liaison officers need credibility with both political leadership and operational units. They must understand military realities well enough to translate between two worlds that often speak different languages. Sarah realized the Allied officers were essentially describing the exact role Admiral Chun had offered her, confirming that the position addressed real strategic needs rather than political window dressing. If American leadership were to create such liaison positions, she asked, what qualities would make someone effective in that role? Commander Nielsen answered immediately. Operational experience that provides credibility with military units, diplomatic skills that enable effective communication with political leadership, and the personal integrity to maintain trust with both constituencies. The conversation continued until nearly midnight, evolving into detailed discussions of specific cooperation challenges and potential solutions that could reshape Allied special operations relationships. Sarah gathered enough intelligence to write reports that would influence American strategic planning for years to come. More importantly, she had demonstrated her ability to build trust, gather information, and facilitate cooperation between experienced military professionals from different nations. The skills that had made her effective as a SEAL operator translated seamlessly to diplomatic contexts when applied with appropriate subtlety and cultural awareness. The next 2 days of formal conference sessions proved equally successful. Sarah participated in discussions about training standardization, intelligence sharing protocols, and resource coordination mechanisms, consistently contributing insights that enhanced American influence while building relationships with Allied representatives. Her final meeting with Colonel Kozlov occurred on the last day of the conference, during a walking tour of Geneva's Old Town that provided privacy for sensitive conversation. "I've been impressed with your performance during these 3 days," Kozlov said as they strolled through medieval streets. "You've demonstrated exactly the kind of professional competence that makes effective cooperation possible. Thank you. I've learned a great deal about Allied perspectives on cooperation challenges. Have you learned enough to convince your leadership that investment in liaison relationships could prevent the kind of failures we discussed during dinner?" Sarah considered the question carefully. "I believe I can make a compelling case for strategic importance of building trust through professional relationships rather than relying solely on formal agreements." Kozlov stopped walking and faced Sarah directly. "Then, perhaps we can accomplish something useful together in future assignments. Professional cooperation between competent individuals who understand operational realities." The handshake they exchanged felt like the conclusion of a successful mission, but Sarah realized it was actually the beginning of something much larger. She had proven to herself and to experienced Allied officers that she could operate effectively in diplomatic contexts while maintaining her essential identity as a special operations professional. The flight back to Washington gave Sarah time to process everything she had experienced and learned during the Geneva conference. She had successfully demonstrated her ability to gather intelligence, build relationships, and represent American interests without relying on her uniform or rank for authority. More importantly, she had discovered that the liaison role would allow her to apply military skills to strategic challenges that could potentially prevent conflicts rather than simply responding to them after they developed. Her phone buzzed with a text from Admiral Chun as the plane descended toward Dulles Airport. "Debrief meeting scheduled for tomorrow 0900. Hope Geneva was educational." That evening, Sarah stood in her apartment looking at her dress blue uniform hanging in the closet, but her perspective had changed completely from 3 weeks earlier. The trident and ribbons still represented achievements she was proud of, but they no longer defined the limits of what she might accomplish in military service. The Geneva conference had taught her that the skills she had developed as a SEAL operator, leadership abilities, strategic thinking, and cultural adaptability could serve much broader purposes than direct action missions. The liaison role would allow her to prevent conflicts through relationship building and strategic cooperation rather than responding to threats after they had already materialized. More fundamentally, Geneva had proven that her authority and effectiveness came from internal qualities that had made her worthy of earning the trident in the first place, rather than from external symbols of military status. She could project competence and command respect based on her character and capabilities, regardless of what uniform she wore or what rank insignia she displayed. The next morning's debrief with Admiral Chen lasted 3 hours, during which Sarah presented detailed intelligence about Allied special operations capabilities, strategic concerns, and cooperation opportunities. She also provided personality assessments of key foreign military leaders and recommendations for future liaison strategies. "Your performance exceeded our expectations," Admiral Chin said after reviewing Sarah's reports. You not only gathered valuable intelligence, but also established relationships that could influence Allied cooperation for years to come. Thank you, ma'am. The experience taught me that the liaison role addresses genuine strategic needs rather than political preferences. Admiral Chen smiled approvingly. Are you ready to accept the position permanently? Sarah took a deep breath, thinking about everything she had learned about herself during the past month. Yes, ma'am. I believe I can serve American interests more effectively in this role than in any other assignment. Excellent. Your first permanent assignment will involve 6 months in Eastern Europe, working with former Soviet bloc nations to develop counterterrorism cooperation agreements. You'll be operating under diplomatic cover with significant autonomy in how you achieve designated objectives. As Sarah left the Pentagon that afternoon, she reflected on how much her understanding of service and identity had evolved since Admiral Thompson first asked her to consider stepping outside her comfort zone. The test had never been about proving she could succeed without her uniform. It had been about discovering that the person who earned the right to wear that uniform was capable of achievements that transcended any single role or assignment. 3 months later, Sarah found herself sitting in a conference room in Prague, wearing civilian clothes while facilitating discussions between Czech, Polish, and Slovak special operations commanders about joint training programs. The work was challenging, complex, and often frustrating, but she woke up each morning knowing that her efforts might prevent conflicts that would otherwise cost thousands of lives. She had become exactly what Admiral Chen had hoped, an officer who could project American strength and competence in any environment, represent military interests to political leadership, and build the kind of trust-based relationships that made genuine cooperation possible. Her SEAL background provided credibility and analytical skills, but her effectiveness came from personal qualities that existed independent of rank or uniform. The transformation was complete, but it hadn't required her to abandon her identity as a special operations professional. Instead, it had required her to expand that identity to encompass responsibilities that utilized military skills in diplomatic contexts while serving strategic objectives that were broader and potentially more impactful than any tactical mission. Lieutenant Sarah Martinez had learned to trust the person inside the uniform, and, in doing so, had discovered that her true potential for service was limitless. When the admirals had asked her to lose the uniform, they hadn't been asking her to become someone different. They had been asking her to become the fullest possible version of who she had always been. The test was over, and she had passed by discovering that the most important uniform she wore was invisible to everyone except herself. The character, competence, and commitment that had made her worthy of earning the visible symbols in the first place.